The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the ballroom as Manhattan's elite mingled in their finest attire. Richard Blackwood adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his steel-gray eyes surveying the charity gala with the calculating precision that had built his empire. At 52, he commanded respect in every room he entered, his presence alone worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. The Blackwood Foundation's annual fundraiser was the social event of the season, where million-dollar donations were made with the casual ease of ordering coffee. But tonight, something felt different. An inexplicable weight pressed against his chest as he moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and handshakes from business associates and socialites. Perhaps it was the approaching anniversary, 18 years since he'd made the decision that transformed him from a struggling entrepreneur into one of America's most ruthless businessmen. 18 years since he'd chosen ambition over love, wealth over family, success over the woman who believed in him when no one else would. Sarah Martinez had been everything Richard wasn't in those early days. Where he was calculating, she was spontaneous. Where he saw obstacles, she saw opportunities for growth. Her laughter could fill a room, and her unwavering faith in his dreams had sustained him through countless sleepless nights in their cramped Brooklyn apartment. She worked double shifts as a nurse while he poured every waking hour into his tech startup, living on instant noodles and shared dreams of a better future. She never complained, never doubted, never asked for anything except his love and commitment. The night he proposed, they had exactly $237 in their joint account. The ring was a modest promise, a small diamond that caught the light from their kitchen window, as she said yes through tears of joy. "We'll build something beautiful together," she had whispered, and he believed her with every fiber of his being. They planned a simple wedding, dreaming of the family they'd raise and the life they'd create from nothing but determination and devotion. Then the phone call came. Marcus Sterling, the venture capitalist who'd been stringing Richard along for months, finally made an offer. $50 million for a 60% stake in the company, with one non-negotiable condition. Richard had to relocate to Silicon Valley immediately. No exceptions, no delays. The opportunity would vanish if he hesitated even for a moment. It was everything he'd worked for, the golden ticket that would transform his life forever. Sarah was 3 months pregnant when he told her about the offer. Her face lit up with pride and excitement, already making plans for their move, talking about the nursery they'd set up in California, the life they'd build for their baby. But Richard had already made his decision. The contract Sterling presented was brutal in its clarity, complete commitment, no distractions, no personal obligations that might compromise his focus. Sterling had made it clear that family men rarely succeeded at the highest levels of business. The night before Richard was supposed to leave, he sat across from Sarah at their tiny kitchen table, the words forming like poison in his throat. "I can't take you with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The confusion in her eyes slowly transformed into disbelief, then devastation. She trusted him completely, and he was about to shatter that trust into a million irreparable pieces. "The baby, Richard," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her barely visible bump. "Our baby." But he'd already convinced himself that this sacrifice was necessary, that success required absolute focus, that he could provide better for them from a distance than he ever could by staying. He told himself he'd return once his empire was established, once he could offer them a life beyond their wildest dreams. But deep down, he knew he was choosing a path that would lead him away from them forever. The next morning, Richard boarded a plane to San Francisco with nothing but a suitcase and a heart already beginning to harden. He never looked back, never called, never sent a single dollar. He buried Sarah and their unborn child in the deepest recesses of his mind, focusing entirely on building the fortune that would define him. Within 5 years, his company went public. Within 10, he was worth hundreds of millions. Within 15, he'd forgotten what love felt like altogether. Now, standing in this opulent ballroom, surrounded by the fruits of his ambition, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change forever. Richard was deep in conversation with Senator Williams about tax legislation when the auction began. The evening's centerpiece was a rare Monet that would likely fetch 8 figures, but his attention wandered as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the grand ballroom. He excused himself and moved toward the bar, needing something stronger than champagne to quiet the strange restlessness that had been building all evening. The bartender poured him a neat whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold, much like everything else in his carefully curated world. As he turned back toward the crowd, his eyes swept across the room with practiced indifference. Senators, tech moguls, pharmaceutical heiresses, entertainment executives, all the usual suspects who populated his social circle. But then, near the silent auction tables on the far side of the ballroom, he saw her. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through his very soul. Sarah Martinez stood examining a painting with quiet intensity, her dark hair now shorter and touched with silver at the temples. But those eyes, those impossibly warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with such love and trust, remained exactly the same. She wore a simple black dress that somehow outshone every designer gown in the room, her natural elegance untouched by the passing years. But it wasn't just Sarah that made his blood turn to ice. Beside her stood a girl who couldn't have been older than 17, with Richard's own steel-gray eyes and Sarah's delicate features, creating a face that was hauntingly beautiful and undeniably familiar. The girl laughed at something Sarah whispered, and the sound cut through Richard like a knife. It was his laugh, the one he'd almost forgotten he possessed, before success had stolen his ability to find joy in simple moments. She moved with Sarah's grace, but held herself with a confidence that reminded him of his younger self, back when he still believed in dreams and promises. The resemblance was so striking that several guests had begun to notice, their conversations growing quieter as they glanced between Richard and the mysterious pair. Richard's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was seeing. The girl, his daughter, was here, in his world, breathing the same air, existing in the space he'd built with a fortune that had cost him everything that truly mattered. She was real, no longer the abstract concept he'd buried in his subconscious, but a living, breathing reminder of the choice he'd made 18 years ago. Every feature of her face told the story of his abandonment, every gesture a testament to the life he'd chosen to miss. Sarah seemed to sense his stare and turned, their eyes meeting across the crowded ballroom for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The years collapsed in an instant, and he was 28 again, standing in their tiny kitchen, watching her heart break as he told her he was leaving. But now there was something different in her gaze, not the devastation he remembered, but a quiet strength that spoke of battles fought and won, of a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of his betrayal. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't show any sign of recognition beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. Instead, she placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder and guided her toward another display, as if Richard Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in America, was nothing more than a stranger not worth acknowledging. The dismissal was so complete, so effortless, that it struck him harder than any accusation or confrontation could have. The girl, Emma, he realized with a start, remembering the name Sarah had chosen during one of their late-night conversations about their future, glanced in his direction with mild curiosity. She had no idea who he was, no concept that the man staring at her with barely controlled emotion was the father who had abandoned her before she drew her first breath. To her, he was just another wealthy stranger in an expensive suit, another face in a crowd of people who live in a world completely separate from hers. Richard found himself moving toward them before his mind could process the decision. Years of boardroom negotiations and hostile takeovers had taught him to control every emotion, to never show weakness or vulnerability. But seeing his daughter, seeing the woman he'd once loved more than life itself, shattered every defense he'd spent decades building. His legs felt unsteady as he navigated through the crowd, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of a man walking toward his own judgment. As he drew closer, He could hear fragments of their conversation. Emma was asking Sarah about the artist whose work they were examining, her voice bright with intelligence and curiosity. Sarah answered with the patient warmth of a mother who had clearly devoted her life to nurturing the mind and spirit of the child Richard had never known. They spoke with the easy intimacy of two people who had faced the world together, who had built something beautiful from the ruins he'd left behind. When Richard was perhaps 10 feet away, Sarah turned again, this time looking directly at him with those eyes that had once seen straight through to his soul. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply stared at each other. The man who had chosen everything and lost what mattered most, and the woman who had been left with nothing and somehow created everything that truly counted. The silence between them stretched like a chasm filled with 18 years of unspoken words, missed birthdays, and dreams that died before they could take flight. Richard found himself frozen in place, his legendary composure crumbling under the weight of Sarah's steady gaze. She had aged beautifully, he realized, not with the artificial preservation that money could buy, but with the natural grace that came from a life lived with purpose and integrity. The lines around her eyes spoke of laughter shared with their daughter, of late nights spent helping with homework, of all the moments he had traded for profit margins and stock options. Emma noticed the sudden tension and looked up at her mother with concern, then followed Sarah's gaze to Richard. "Mom, is everything okay?" The girl's voice carried a maturity that spoke of someone who had learned early to read her mother's moods, to offer comfort when shadows crossed her face. It was the voice of a daughter who had been both child and confidant, who had helped fill the void left by an absent father without ever knowing his identity. Sarah's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she smoothed Emma's hair, a gesture so tender and protective that it made Richard's chest tighten with a pain he hadn't felt in decades. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she said softly, never taking her eyes off Richard. "Why don't you go find some of those chocolate-covered strawberries? I saw them near the dessert table." It was clearly a dismissal, a mother's instinct to shield her child from whatever storm was about to break. But Emma was too perceptive to be easily misdirected. She glanced again at Richard, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel completely exposed. "You look familiar," she said suddenly, tilting her head in a gesture that was purely Sarah's. "Have we met before? Maybe at one of Mom's hospital fundraisers." The innocence in her question was like a dagger to Richard's heart. His own daughter was trying to place his face, searching her memory for a connection that had never existed. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. How could he explain that he was the ghost who had haunted every milestone of her life from a distance? How could he tell her that he had chosen money over the chance to read her bedtime stories, to teach her to ride a bike, to hold her when nightmares made her cry? The magnitude of what he had lost hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he had to grip the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. Sarah stepped forward slightly, positioning herself between Richard and Emma with the subtle grace of a mother who had spent years being both protector and provider. "Emma, this is Richard Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's an old acquaintance from before you were born. Mr. Blackwood, this is my daughter, Emma Martinez." The formal introduction was a masterpiece of restraint, revealing nothing while saying everything. She wasn't going to make this moment about her pain or his guilt. She was going to protect their daughter from the complicated truth until she decided otherwise. Emma's eyes widened slightly at the name. Even at 17, she knew who Richard Blackwood was. His face had been on magazine covers. His company's logo was everywhere. His foundation's name was literally emblazoned above the entrance to the ballroom. "Oh, wow," she said, extending her hand with the confident manners her mother had clearly instilled in her. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. Thank you for hosting such a beautiful event. The art collection is incredible." Richard stared down at her outstretched hand, his daughter's hand, and felt something inside him break completely. She was thanking him for hosting a party with money that should have been used to give her everything she deserved. She was being gracious to the man who had abandoned her before she existed, who had chosen success over the chance to be her father. The irony was so bitter it was almost unbearable. Slowly, with hands that shook despite his best efforts, Richard reached out and took Emma's hand in his. The moment their skin touched, he felt a connection that transcended 18 years of absence. She was his blood, his legacy, the best part of himself that he had thrown away for the worst. "The honor is mine, Emma," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. You're absolutely extraordinary." Something in his tone made Emma pause, her head tilting again as she studied his face more carefully. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Blackwood? You look a little pale." The concern in her voice, his daughter worried about his well-being, nearly brought him to his knees. She had inherited Sarah's compassionate heart along with his eyes, and the combination was devastating in its beauty. "I'm fine," Richard lied, reluctantly releasing her hand before he betrayed himself completely. "Just overwhelmed by how beautiful the evening has become." He looked at Sarah as he said it, hoping she would understand the layers of meaning in his words. She had always been able to read him like an open book, and even now, after all these years, she seemed to understand exactly what he was trying to say. Emma smiled, a radiant expression that lit up her entire face and reminded Richard so powerfully of young Sarah that he had to look away. "Mom always says that the most beautiful things in life are the ones you don't expect," she said, glancing between them with growing curiosity. "Like finding amazing art in places you never thought to look, or meeting interesting people when you're just trying to enjoy some chocolate strawberries." Sarah's breath caught almost inaudibly at their daughter's words, and Richard saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Emma had unknowingly described the moment of their reunion with the poetic insight of someone who had been raised by a woman who found meaning in everything, who had taught their daughter to see beauty even in the midst of pain. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Victoria Ashford, Richard's current companion, a stunning socialite 30 years his junior, who collected wealthy men like accessories. She glided toward them with practiced elegance, her diamond necklace catching the light with every calculated step. "Darling, there you are," she purred, sliding her manicured hand possessively around Richard's arm. "Senator Williams is asking about the hospital wing donation. He needs to speak with you before." Her words died as she noticed Sarah and Emma, her perfectly sculpted features shifting into a mask of polite curiosity tinged with territorial suspicion. Richard felt Victoria's presence like a weight around his neck, a reminder of the shallow existence he had built for himself. Every relationship in his life had become transactional, every emotion measured against its potential impact on his empire. Victoria represented everything his world had become: beautiful, expensive, and utterly hollow. Standing next to Sarah and Emma, she seemed like a caricature of wealth, all surface and no substance. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez and her daughter Emma," Richard said, his voice strained. "Sarah is a nurse, and Emma is—" He faltered, realizing he knew nothing about his own daughter's dreams, ambitions, or talents. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Emma stepped forward with the same grace her mother possessed. "I'm a senior at Brooklyn Academy," Emma said with quiet pride. "I'm hoping to study medicine like my mom, maybe specialize in pediatric cardiology. We're here tonight because Mom received an invitation through the hospital where she works. Apparently someone thought her 23 years of service to underprivileged children deserved recognition." The way she spoke about Sarah was filled with such obvious love and admiration that Richard felt his heart constrict. His daughter was proud of her mother, protective of her, in ways he had never experienced from anyone. Victoria's smile became more forced as she processed this information. A nurse and her daughter for Brooklyn were hardly the type of people she expected to encounter at Manhattan's most exclusive charity gala. "How inspiring," she managed, her tone suggesting anything but inspiration. "Richard, we really should—" "Actually, Mrs. Martinez," Richard interrupted, surprising everyone, including himself, "I'd very much like to hear more about your work. 23 years in pediatric nursing is an extraordinary achievement." He looked directly at Sarah, seeing beyond the composed exterior to the woman who had built a meaningful life from the ruins he had left behind. While he had been accumulating wealth, she had been saving lives. While he had been building his reputation, she had been raising their daughter to be remarkable. Sarah's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. "It's been rewarding work," she said simply. "There's nothing quite like helping a child heal, watching families come together in the face of crisis. It teaches you what really matters in life." The subtle emphasis on her last words wasn't lost on Richard. She was telling him, without accusation or bitterness, that she had learned lessons he had forgotten he ever knew. Emma beamed at her mother's words, clearly having heard stories of Sarah's heroic work countless times. Mom once worked 36 hours straight during a crisis in the cardiac unit. She saved 3 children that weekend, including a little girl who had been abandoned by her parents. The parallel was unmistakable. Sarah had dedicated her life to caring for abandoned children while raising one herself, turning her personal pain into a source of healing for others. Victoria's impatience was becoming obvious, her grip on Richard's arm tightening. "Darling, we really must speak with the senator. The donation announcement is scheduled for 9:30. She was trying to pull him away from this unexpected confrontation with his past, back to the safe superficiality of his constructed world. But Richard found himself rooted in place, unable to tear himself away from the sight of his daughter's animated face as she spoke about her mother's work. Emma had Sarah's passionate heart, but with a fire in her eyes that reminded him of his own younger self, before cynicism and ambition had extinguished his capacity for genuine emotion. She was everything he might have been if he had made different choices, if he had chosen love over money, family over success. "The senator can wait," Richard said quietly, his words surprising Victoria and causing Sarah's eyebrows to raise slightly. In his world, powerful men didn't wait. They demanded immediate attention and received it. But standing here, faced with the family he had abandoned, Richard felt the foundations of his carefully constructed priorities beginning to crumble. Victoria's shock at being dismissed was palpable, her perfectly composed mask slipping for just a moment to reveal the calculating woman beneath. "Richard, I don't think you understand the importance," she began. But Richard cut her off with a look that had silenced boardrooms full of executives. The power dynamic shifted instantly, and Victoria realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. In the 3 years she had been with Richard Blackwood, she had never seen him prioritize anything over business or social obligations. "Victoria, please give us a moment," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll find you later." It was a dismissal so complete and unexpected that several nearby guests turned to watch the drama unfold. Victoria's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she was too well trained in the art of social warfare to cause a scene. Instead, she smiled tightly, kissed Richard's cheek with calculated precision, and glided away, but not before shooting Sarah a look that promised future consequences. With Victoria gone, an awkward silence settled over the trio. Emma, with the social intuition of someone raised by a single mother who had navigated difficult situations with grace, seemed to sense the undercurrents she couldn't quite understand. "I should probably go find those strawberries now," she said diplomatically, but Sarah caught her hand gently. "Actually, sweetheart, why don't you stay? Mr. Blackwood was asking about our work." Sarah's decision to keep Emma present was deliberate. She wasn't going to allow Richard to have a private conversation that might complicate their daughter's life without her being part of it. After 18 years of making every decision about Emma's well-being alone, she wasn't about to be excluded from whatever this encounter might bring. Richard felt a surge of gratitude, mixed with profound regret. Even now, Sarah was protecting their daughter, while also protecting him from making impulsive decisions that could hurt them all. She had always been the wiser one, the one who thought about consequences while he chased immediate gratification. "I'd like that very much," he said, looking at Emma with wonder that he struggled to conceal. "Tell me about your plans for medical school. What drew you to pediatric cardiology, specifically?" Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm, and Richard was struck by how much she resembled Sarah when passionate, about something meaningful. I've been volunteering at Mom's hospital since I was 14, she began, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke about her dreams. There's this little boy, maybe 5 years old, who came in with a congenital heart defect. His parents were terrified, couldn't speak much English, and had no insurance. I watched Mom coordinate not just his medical care, but translation services, financial assistance, emotional support for the whole family. As Emma spoke, Richard found himself hanging on every word, desperate to learn everything about the remarkable young woman his daughter had become. She gestured with her hands when she got excited, just as Sarah used to do, but there was something else in her manner, a quiet determination that reminded him of himself at her age, before cynicism had hardened his heart. The surgery was successful, but the recovery was long and difficult. Emma continued. I spent hours with that family, helping translate, playing games with the boy, just being present. When he finally went home, completely healed, his father cried and told Mom that she and I were angels sent by God. That's when I knew I wanted to spend my life giving children and families hope when everything seems hopeless. Richard felt tears threatening. Actual tears, something he hadn't experienced in so many years he had forgotten he was capable of them. His daughter had inherited the best of both her parents, Sarah's compassionate heart and his own drive for excellence. But unlike him, she had chosen to use her gifts in service of others rather than herself. She was the person he might have become if he had made different choices, if he had valued love over success. That's extraordinary, Emma, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother raised an incredible young woman. He looked at Sarah as he spoke, trying to convey the depth of his admiration and regret. She had done what he never could have. She had raised their daughter to be someone who made the world better simply by existing in it. Emma blushed at the compliment, but her eyes sparkled with pride. Mom's the incredible one. She put herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs, saved every penny to make sure I could focus on my studies instead of worrying about money. She's never missed a school play, a science fair, a parent-teacher conference. She's been everything to me. The simple statement carried the weight of 18 years of devotion, of a mother who had been both parents because the father had chosen to be neither. Richard felt the full impact of Emma's words like a physical blow. While he had been building his empire, Sarah had been building something far more valuable, a relationship with their daughter that was founded on love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. He had millions of dollars and no one who truly knew him. Sarah had raised their daughter on a nurse's salary and created a bond that was worth more than all his wealth combined. She sounds like the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Richard said quietly, looking directly at Sarah. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, and he saw a flash of a young woman who had once loved him with her whole heart. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the protective strength of a mother who had learned to guard her heart against further damage. The moment was shattered by Emma's sudden gasp of recognition. She had been studying Richard's face throughout their conversation, and something had finally clicked into place. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "You have the same eyes as me. Exactly the same." The observation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and Richard watched as the pieces began falling into place in his daughter's brilliant mind. Sarah's face went pale, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. She had spent 17 years preparing for this moment, knowing that someday Emma's intelligence would lead her to ask the right questions. But standing here, watching her daughter's world potentially shatter in real time, all her rehearsed explanations crumbled into dust. Emma looked back and forth between them, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Mom," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "Mom, why are you looking at him like that? Why does he have my eyes?" The questions came faster now, her mind racing through years of inconsistencies she had never questioned before. "You never talk about my father. You always said he died before I was born, but you never show me pictures, never told me stories. You said you lost everything in a fire, but—" Richard felt his heart breaking as he watched his daughter's world collapse. This was exactly what he had feared, exactly why he had never reached out. His presence in their lives was a poison that destroyed everything it touched. "Emma," he said gently, reaching toward her, but she stepped back as if his touch might burn her. "No," Emma said, her voice growing stronger and more accusatory. "No, I need to understand what's happening here. Mom, is Richard Blackwood my father?" The question was asked with the precision of someone who already knew the answer, but desperately hoped to be wrong. "Is the man who abandoned us worth more money than I could ever imagine?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart. Richard is your biological father." The admission seemed to cost her everything. 18 years of protection and careful lies crumbling in an instant. "But Emma, please understand, I was trying to protect you from what?" Emma's voice rose, drawing concerned glances from nearby guests. "From knowing that my father chose money over me, that while we were struggling to pay rent, he was living in mansions, that he could have helped us, but decided we weren't worth his time." Each word was like a dagger, cutting through Richard's defenses and revealing the ugly truth of his choices. Richard wanted to defend himself, to explain the circumstances, to somehow justify the unjustifiable. But looking at his daughter's tear-filled eyes that were indeed identical to his own, he realized there was no explanation that could make his abandonment acceptable. "Emma, you're right to be angry," he said quietly. "I made an unforgivable choice 18 years ago. I chose success over family, and I've regretted it every day since." "Have you?" Emma's laugh was bitter, far too mature for someone who should still be worried about prom dates and college applications. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been pretty happy with your choice. Beautiful women, fancy parties, your name on buildings. What exactly have you been regretting?" The accusation hit its mark because it was partially true. Richard had buried his regret so deep that it had become background noise in his life, easy to ignore when surrounded by success and admiration. But seeing Emma now, seeing the woman she had become without him, the regret was overwhelming everything else. Sarah stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. "Sweetheart, let's go. We don't belong here, and we don't need this drama in our lives." She had made the same decision 18 years ago, to protect their daughter from the pain Richard's presence would bring. Now she was making it again, choosing Emma's emotional well-being over any potential reconciliation. But Emma shrugged off her mother's hand, her teenage defiance mixing with genuine hurt and confusion. "No, Mom. I need to hear this from him. I need to understand how someone can walk away from their own child." She turned back to Richard, her eyes blazing with a fury that was magnificent and terrible. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, what was more important than your daughter? What was worth abandoning your family for?" Richard looked at this fierce, brilliant young woman, his daughter, and realized that she deserved the complete truth, no matter how damning it was. "Control," he said simply. "I wanted to control my own destiny, to never be powerless again. I grew up poor, Emma, and I swore I would never be at anyone's mercy. When the opportunity came to build an empire, I convinced myself that financial security was more important than love. And now," Emma demanded, "was it worth it? Are you happy with the trade you made?" Richard looked around the opulent ballroom, at the wealth and power he had accumulated, at the shallow relationships and empty achievements that filled his days. Then he looked back at Emma and Sarah, at the love and strength they had built without him, at the meaningful life his daughter was planning despite his absence. "No," he said, the word carrying the weight of 18 years of regret. "It wasn't worth it. You and your mother are worth more than everything I've built, and I was too selfish and frightened to see it when it mattered." Emma stared at Richard for a long moment, her anger slowly giving way to something more complex. Disappointment mixed with pity. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You could have had everything. You could have been rich and still been my father. But you chose to believe that love and success couldn't coexist, and that choice cost you the only things that actually matter." Richard felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. In his relentless pursuit of control, he had given up the one thing that couldn't be bought, sold, or negotiated, the unconditional love of his own child. "Emma, if I could go back." "But you can't," she interrupted, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "And even if you could, how do I know you wouldn't make the same choice again? How do I trust someone who threw away his family like we were worthless?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable, because Richard knew in his heart that she was right to doubt him. Sarah had remained silent during this exchange, watching her daughter navigate this devastating revelation with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Emma was handling this confrontation with more grace and wisdom than many adults would, but Sarah could see the deep wounds being carved into her daughter's heart in real time. "We should go," Sarah said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma, you said what you needed to say. There's nothing more to be gained here." She looked at Richard one last time, her expression unreadable. "Goodbye, Richard. I hope you find whatever it is you're still searching for." As they began to walk away, Richard felt panic rising in his chest. He couldn't let them disappear from his life again, couldn't lose his second chance at redemption. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom and causing several heads to turn. "Please, just wait." Emma and Sarah stopped, but didn't turn around. Richard could see the tension in Sarah's shoulders, the way she instinctively moved to shield Emma from further pain. For 18 years, she had been their daughter's sole protector, and even now, she was ready to fight the entire world to keep Emma safe. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," Richard said, walking toward them with hesitant steps. "But Emma, you're about to start college, to begin your medical career. Let me help. Let me do something meaningful with the money I chose over you." Emma finally turned, her eyes flashing with fresh anger. "You think you can buy your way into my life now? After 18 years of nothing, you want to write a check and call yourself a father?" The suggestion clearly offended her deeply, and Richard realized he had once again chosen the wrong approach. "That's not what I meant," he said desperately. "I just want to help you achieve your dreams. You want to save children's lives. I can make sure you have every opportunity to do that. I'll achieve my dreams the same way I've done everything else," Emma replied with quiet dignity. "With my mother's support and my own hard work. I don't need your guilt money, Mr. Blackwood. I never have." With that final rejection, Emma took Sarah's arm, and they walked away together, leaving Richard standing alone among the crystal chandeliers and hollow conversations of his empty empire. As he watched them disappear through the ballroom doors, he realized he had finally learned the difference between the price of everything and the value of nothing.